Power doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it arrives in silence, not with sirens or scandal, but with a single envelope, quietly delivered, carefully timed, and devastatingly precise. On the day a tech mogul was set to marry his glamorous assistant, a discreet envelope arrived from his former wife. What it contained wasn't a plea or a threat. It was a quiet revelation that unraveled his empire from within. He thought she was replaceable. He never imagined she held the keys to everything. The soft hum of blues floated from the hidden ceiling speakers, blending with the faint clink of ice swirling in a crystal tumbler of scotch. Nathaniel Brooks leaned back into the custom-made suede chair in his penthouse office. One leg crossed, fingers tapping in rhythm on the armrest as he stared out through the panoramic windows overlooking the Manhattan skyline. The city glowed under the golden haze of dusk, with helicopters darting between towers and the river below gleaming like molten gold. He wasn't thinking about business tonight. The acquisition had finalized, the partnership with the Asian conglomerate was secured, and every financial blog had plastered his name across the headlines. His empire wasn't just flourishing, it was dominating. But tonight, Nathaniel wasn't toasting success. He was preparing for something far more personal, something that felt less like closure and more like reinvention. The door clicked open quietly as someone stepped inside. Madison Clark, his executive assistant, or, as most of his circle quietly assumed, much more than that, entered with the calm confidence of someone who is used to power. Her blazer was draped over one arm, her silk blouse slightly unbuttoned, but nothing about her presence was careless. Everything Madison did was calculated, from the cadence of her voice to the subtle weight of her gaze. "Mr. Brooks," she said smoothly, placing a folder on the desk. "The courier just delivered these final documents from the divorce attorney. Your signature's the only thing left now." He took the folder, briefly glancing at the header before flipping it open. "About time," he muttered, picking up his pen. Madison didn't respond. She stood quietly at the corner of the desk, eyes not on his hand or the paper, but on his face. He didn't blink. He didn't pause. Not even a flicker of doubt creased his brow as he signed away a 17-year marriage with effortless strokes of ink. "That's it," he said, closing the folder. "It's official." Madison gave a slight nod, and for a moment neither of them spoke. Then, in a voice more personal than professional, she asked, "How do you feel?" Nathaniel turned toward her and offered a faint smile, lifting his glass slightly. The room fell quiet again, except for the soft strains of blues humming in the background. Nathaniel looked around, taking in the sleek decor, the abstract art pieces hung with deliberate spacing on the walls, and the built-in shelves filled with rare architectural volumes. Books he never read, only displayed for the image they presented. Everything had been curated to look instinctive and refined, and everything was his. His choices, his aesthetics, his empire. Except it hadn't always been that way. For over a decade, that vision had been shared with Serena Brooks. Now just a signature on a court order, she had once walked through these rooms with sketches in her hands and vision in her eyes. She had chosen the color palettes, fought for the custom furniture, and insisted on installing the rooftop greenhouse that he now claimed as his personal sanctuary. She had never needed recognition. Her influence had always been woven into the subtle details, the inviting warmth in every room, the peaceful balance in the design. But eventually, that balance turned into emptiness, and emptiness into disregard. Nathaniel stood and walked to the floor-to-ceiling window, his reflection overlaying the gleaming skyline, merging with the man he now embodied, tailored, untouchable, admired, feared. He took another sip of his scotch. "She didn't even fight it," he said quietly, more to himself than to Madison. "Didn't challenge anything, just signed and vanished." Madison tilted her head slightly. "Maybe she was just done too." He let out a dry chuckle. Serena was never the type to leave without a trace. Madison raised an eyebrow but didn't reply. Instead, she stepped forward and rested a hand gently on his arm. "The past is behind you now. What matters is what's next." Nathaniel glanced at her hand, then up at her eyes. The faint curve of her mouth suggested something unspoken, something that had lingered between them longer than either would admit. He didn't move away. "You're right," he murmured. "It's time to move forward." Across the river, tucked in a second-story apartment wedged between rows of old brownstones, Serena Brooks sat at a small, chipped dining table covered in faded stationery, scattered receipts, and a worn ceramic mug with a missing handle. Her damp hair clung to her face, and a soft wool cardigan hung loosely over her shoulders. Her eyes were fixed on the envelope in front of her, thick, beige, and heavy with finality. The divorce decree had arrived hours ago, but she hadn't opened it yet. She didn't need to. She had memorized its contents months earlier. Back when the first draft landed on her doorstep, there were no surprises left, at least not on paper. The real ones had already passed. The way Nathaniel's voice had become more detached, how his eyes stopped resting on her, how he simply stopped coming home without explanation. The past few years hadn't been a collapse. They had been a slow erasure. Still, something about the sealed envelope sitting on the table unsettled her. It wasn't grief, it wasn't rage. It was something stranger, emptiness, like reaching the final chapter of a book you didn't realize you were already halfway through. Eventually, Serena opened it, eyes quickly scanning through the pages before signing her name. She noticed her handwriting had changed. Tighter, more angular, less fluid. She wondered if that meant anything. The apartment was still, save for the steady drip of the leaky kitchen faucet. On the worn-out sofa, her 17-year-old son, Micah, was asleep, curled up with his backpack still half-zipped beside him. She got up, walked over, and gently pulled a blanket over him. His features, so much like Nathaniel's, looked serene in sleep, innocent, blissfully unaware of the unraveling world around them. Serena returned to the kitchen and sat again. Her phone buzzed on the table. It was a message from her closest friend, Dana. "How are you holding up?" She stared at the screen for a moment before typing, "I'm fine, just tired." It was a lie, but it was simpler than trying to explain what tired truly meant. Not just physical fatigue, but exhaustion down to her bones, her soul. Tired of pretending, tired of scraping by, tired of being composed while watching the life she built be replaced by someone shinier, younger, newer. She reached into a cupboard and pulled down a small wooden box. Inside, tucked beneath old photographs and a few dried petals from a long-forgotten bouquet, was a letter she had written years ago and never sent. She unfolded it carefully, reading every line as if they belonged to someone else. Then something changed in her expression, subtle, but undeniable. A thought, a spark, a seed of something not yet fully formed, but alive. She folded the letter back and looked out the narrow kitchen window, where distant city lights blinked over rooftops. Somewhere out there, Nathaniel was probably sipping imported scotch and basking in victory. But Serena no longer felt defeated. A quiet strength was beginning to take root beneath the ache in her chest. Before the night ended, she opened her laptop and began to type a name, a message, a beginning. Whatever came next, she would no longer be a footnote in Nathaniel Brooks' story. She would write her own. Was it justice or just karma? Rate this story from 0 to 10, hit that like button, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories that'll keep you hooked until the very last second. The days following the finalized divorce crawled by like molasses through winter. Serena Brooks found herself waking long before sunrise. Not out of routine and certainly not by choice, but under the crushing weight of her thoughts. Her mind refused rest, even when her body begged for sleep. The apartment was always cold in the mornings, the old radiator groaning and clanking as it tried to push out warmth. Most days, Serena sat at the edge of her bed, wrapped in a thick fleece robe, staring at the wall in silence before finally forcing herself to move. She didn't know what she was waiting for. A moment, a shift, a sign. But all she had was silence and a vast stretch of not knowing. The kitchen still smelled faintly of coffee from the night before. She reheated a cup in the microwave, though it tasted stale and bitter, as if even the coffee had lost its will. Standing by the narrow window with the chipped mug cupped between her hands, she watched the city stir below. Trucks rumbled down the street, delivery guys hustled, neon signs blinked awake one by one. Everything moved forward. But Serena stood still, trapped between what was and whatever came next. Outwardly, she looked composed. Neighbors greeted her with nods and polite smiles. The clerk at the bodega asked about Micah. Her sister called every day with some chipper version of comfort. "You just need a fresh start," she said, as if starting over was like flipping on a lamp. Serena always nodded, said thank you, and hung up. But inside, she felt herself unraveling, slowly, quietly, thread by thread. The manila envelope from the lawyer still sat on the coffee table. She had signed everything already, but she couldn't move it. It felt like a scab she wasn't ready to let heal. Every time she walked past, her eyes drifted to it, half expecting it to say something she hadn't noticed. It never did. It just sat there, cold, final. Micah moved through the apartment with that aimless teenage energy, headphones on, door closed, barely saying a word. Serena didn't push. She knew he was trying to cope in his own way. Sometimes, though, he'd ask something that gutted her. Do you think Dad's happier now? Or was it me? Did I do something wrong? Her response was always the same, soft, steady. No, baby. None of this is your fault. But she wasn't sure if he believed her. Nathaniel, meanwhile, had thrown himself into his new chapter without hesitation. Photos had already started making their rounds online. Tasteful candids from galas and rooftop cocktail hours. Perfectly lit, perfectly framed. Nathaniel grinning with a drink in hand. Madison beside him, her arm casually draped across his. The captions were subtle, but intentional. Power. Couple reimagined. Tech mogul seen with glamorous associate at charity gala. Serena hadn't gone looking for them, but they found her anyway. Through suggested articles, through forwarded messages. The way gossip always does. Sharp and accurate, like a heat-seeking missile. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. What she felt was colder. A low, flat sense of betrayal that no longer had edges sharp enough to hurt. Not because it wasn't painful, but because it was no longer shocking. It was simply confirmation of what she'd already known. She'd been written out of Nathaniel's story, erased, edited like a discarded chapter in a book he didn't care to reread. But she remembered. All of it. The late nights reviewing his proposals, rewriting language he'd later present as his own. The endless boardroom meetings where she sat silently, nodding, backing him, while he played the visionary. She remembered what she gave up, the career she set aside, the identity she put on hold so he could shine. All those quiet concessions made in the name of partnership that eventually blurred her reflection in the mirror. She remembered when Madison first joined the firm, all expensive perfume and unearned confidence. And she remembered how Nathaniel had vouched for her from day one. She's got potential, he'd said. Now Serena knew exactly what kind of potential he'd seen. One night, when sleep wouldn't come, she opened a desk drawer and pulled out a weathered notebook she hadn't touched in years. Inside were faded sketches, handwritten plans, and scribbled business models. She flipped through the pages slowly, reacquainting herself with a version of her she thought had vanished. There were outlines for a niche consultancy, a vision board for a lifestyle publication that never got off the ground, ideas that once lit her up before she buried them under years of sacrifice. The notebook trembled slightly in her hands, and she noticed something unexpected. Her heart was racing, not from grief, but from something else. A pulse of curiosity, a whisper, what if I still could? She closed the notebook and placed it on the table. Then she walked to the living room, stared at the manila divorce envelope for a long moment, and moved it aside. She replaced it with the notebook, right in the center. And something in her shifted. Not anger, not quite rebellion, but intent, a seed of resolve she hadn't felt in years. The next morning, Serena dialed a number she hadn't called in a long time. Celia Ramirez, a mentor who had once invited her to co-found a business. Serena had once turned down her own career to support Nathaniel's ambitions. The phone rang twice before someone picked up. Celia's voice was exactly how Serena remembered. Warm, no nonsense. Serena? Celia said, surprised. It's been a while. I know, Serena replied softly. But I was wondering, do you still have that space downtown? The one you were thinking of turning into a co-working hub? There was a pause. I do. Celia said eventually. It's just sitting there, to be honest. I have an idea, Serena said, her voice steadier now, stronger. And I think I'm ready to do something about it. Celia didn't answer right away. Then she gave a low, knowing laugh. I always told you, you had more in you than you let the world see. Come by tomorrow, let's talk. When the call ended, Serena remained seated for several minutes, letting the weight of the moment settle around her like dust floating in sunlight. She didn't know what this meant. Not yet. She didn't even fully know what she wanted to build. But for the first time in a long time, she didn't feel like she was just waiting for something to happen. She was reaching for something. Undefined, unclear, but hers. That afternoon, she received a package from the law firm, an official copy of the finalized divorce decree, stamped and notarized. She opened the envelope, glanced at the signature page, then slid it into a file folder and tucked it deep into the cabinet. It wasn't something she needed to see again. It wasn't her story anymore. Later that evening, after dinner, Micah sat beside her on the couch, eyes fixed on his phone. "Mom," he said suddenly, without looking up, "are we going to be okay?" Serena looked at him for a long moment before answering. "We already are." He didn't say anything else, but he gave a small nod and leaned his head against her shoulder. She pressed a kiss to his temple and wrapped her arm around him. And for the first time since the papers arrived, Serena believed the words she had just said. Up in the penthouse, Nathaniel was pouring a glass of red wine. Madison sat across from him, legs tucked beneath her, speaking in hushed tones about the upcoming gala, which sponsors to highlight, which media outlets to invite. He looked calm, at ease, settled into his new chapter. But what he hadn't noticed were the subtle fractures forming in the places he thought were solid. He hadn't seen how Madison's gaze lingered a moment too long on his private documents, how she began subtly rerouting his meetings. He didn't yet realize that some of the people he considered loyal were quietly creating distance, uneasy with the sudden reshaping of his personal life, uncertain about this new version of him. Nathaniel was too preoccupied enjoying the illusion of momentum to sense the ground shifting beneath him. And somewhere, under Serena's pillow, was a letter, one she had written in the quietest hours of the night. She didn't leave a letter to him, but about him, about the truths buried beneath the surface of the empire he believed untouchable. Secrets no one else knew. Rewritten history that she had lived. Serena hadn't decided if she'd ever send it, but deep down, she knew she wouldn't need to. The lavish dining room of Nathaniel Brooks' penthouse sparkled beneath the soft shimmer of a custom-designed chandelier. Its cascading crystal strands caught the light with every subtle movement, creating an illusion of constant motion. The lawn marble dining table, once the setting for quiet family dinners, had been rebranded for curated brunches, exclusive wine tastings, and hyper-curated networking nights. It no longer echoed with Micah's childhood jokes or Serena's melodic voice recounting art exhibits or getaway plans. Those sounds belonged to another era. Now, the air pulsed with something different. Crisp business talk, playful toasts, and the kind of laughter that came only when the stakes were high and loyalty was transactional. At the center of this rebranding stood Madison Clark. No longer just the efficient assistant who managed his calendar, but the woman who now set the tone of his lifestyle. She had blended into the space quickly. Within weeks of Serena's exit, Madison had replaced the neutral cushions with plush velvet, swapped out family portraits for modern abstract canvases, and scented the penthouse with high-end candles laced with oud and fig. Nathaniel hadn't resisted. In fact, he welcomed it, called it progress. He didn't miss Serena, or so he told himself. She was a necessary chapter in his rise, yes, but not part of the cover story. She had been steady, generous, but familiar. And to Nathaniel, familiarity bordered on irrelevance. Madison, in contrast, provoked him. She had sharp edges wrapped in charm. She asserted herself, not loudly but deliberately, and he found that magnetic. She didn't orbit his world. She carved a place within it, and Nathaniel respected anything or anyone he found useful. Still, the transition wasn't without friction. There were details he hadn't expected, tiny ripples in the current. Some of his long-term business partners weren't as enthusiastic as he anticipated. At one private luncheon, a senior investor leaned in and said quietly, "You know, Serena had this way of keeping everything grounded. You've lost that." Nathaniel had smiled, shifted the conversation, but the words stuck. Another deal collapsed with no warning. He told himself it was market instability, but in truth, something was shifting. Quiet, unspoken, but real. Serena had always served as Nathaniel's social compass, refined, gracious, intuitive. Madison, though competent, brought a different energy, more assertive, less diplomatic. While Madison helped shape Nathaniel's public image in glittering circles, Serena was navigating a quieter kind of transition. one without champagne or curated spotlights. The downtown studio space Celia had offered was dusty and unkempt, still bearing the marks of its previous tenants: tattered posters, a splintered chair, and a half-used coffee machine that hissed and groaned when plugged in. But it had windows. Big, gorgeous windows that welcomed sunlight in long streams, bouncing off the polished concrete floors and painting the room in possibility. To Serena, it was a canvas, raw, unfinished. But hers. She visited every afternoon after finishing part-time administrative work with a boutique marketing firm, something she picked up temporarily to keep the bills paid. Each day she arrived carrying boxes, materials, paints, reference books, and hopeful intentions. The space slowly began to shift. One wall was painted a moody green. A bookshelf went up, filled with design guides and books on entrepreneurship. She found a vintage sofa at a second-hand shop and gave it a home by the window. She wasn't sure yet what the studio would become, maybe a consultancy, a co-working hub for creatives, or even a micro-gallery. All she knew was that it would reflect her. Not a response to Nathaniel's world, but a rediscovery of her own. A voice she had silenced under years of being someone else's gravity. Micah often joined her after school, sometimes to do homework, sometimes just to help clean or paint. He didn't talk much, but his quiet company grounded her. They were rebuilding something together, wordlessly. One evening, as they were shelving books, he asked without looking up, "Why are you doing all this, Mom?" She paused, her hand resting on a hardcover. "Because I need to remember what I'm capable of," she said gently. He didn't ask anything else. He just nodded and kept helping. Back at the penthouse, Madison had begun sliding into roles Serena once filled. She answered Nathaniel's calls during meetings. She scheduled his travel. She negotiated contracts and made executive decisions, often without checking in first. At first, Nathaniel admired her initiative. But the shine began to dull. She snapped at staff. She dismissed legitimate concerns from his executive team. One senior manager resigned without warning, citing a toxic work environment. Nathaniel dismissed it as fragility. He'd always believed pressure built diamonds, but cracks were appearing. And not just in his staff. Madison had started making requests. He had moved several investment accounts under Madison's name, saying it would streamline business logistics. Nathaniel agreed without much thought. He trusted her, or more accurately, he trusted the idea of her. The polished narrative he had written in his mind about their smooth partnership. Trust had become a formality, not an emotion. He'd done the same with Serena for years. It had never failed him then. He didn't recognize the irony, or maybe he chose not to. But what he did notice was the growing gap between them. Even though they spent more time together than ever, the conversations had shifted from connection to coordination. Madison didn't laugh at his jokes like she used to. He'd catch her texting at night, then quickly silencing her phone when he walked into the room. When he asked, she shrugged. "Clients," she said casually, "just work." But Nathaniel, despite his pride, wasn't entirely blind. He started asking himself questions he never thought he'd have to. Not out of distrust, but from a creeping fear of being outmaneuvered. One morning, while preparing for a high-stakes board presentation, he reached for a folder on his desk and froze. One of the reports had been altered. The numbers didn't match his version. He called Madison in. She didn't flinch. "I revised them last night," she said smoothly. "Your figures were outdated." He stared at her, unsure whether to feel impressed or undermined. "I wasn't aware you made those decisions now," he said, his tone controlled. She smiled faintly, leaning against the edge of his desk. "I thought we were building this together," she replied. "Or am I mistaken?" Nathaniel said nothing. She walked out moments later, but her words lingered like smoke. Across town, Serena sat at her studio desk, sketching over a blank blueprint. She had just outlined an idea, a workshop series focused on professional reinvention for women over 40. It wasn't fully formed yet, just lines on a page. But it felt right. It felt like something she would have needed years ago, back when she first started feeling unseen. She picked up her phone and called Celia. "I want to host a launch event," she said. "Something small. A soft opening, just to test the idea." Celia didn't hesitate. "I'll help you coordinate. Serena, you've got something here." After hanging up, Serena sat still for a moment, adrenaline coursing through her. Not fear this time, but momentum. Her hands trembled slightly, not from panic but anticipation. This wasn't about proving herself to Nathaniel, or reclaiming what she had lost. It was about rediscovering the pieces of herself she'd given away without hesitation. That night, as Nathaniel scrolled through his calendar, a free evening caught his eye, an unexpected gap in next week's schedule. As Madison passed behind him, she glanced at the screen. "We should do something," she said. "Then maybe a dinner party," Madison said lightly. "Show everyone the new us." Nathaniel hesitated. "The new us?" he repeated. She smiled, brushing her hand along his shoulder. "That's what this is, isn't it?" He nodded slowly, though something about the phrase caught in his chest. He poured himself another drink and wandered to the window, staring out at the ink-dark skyline. Somewhere out there, Serena was rebuilding, without luxury, without influence, without insulation. And for reasons he couldn't quite articulate, that unsettled him more than anything Madison had said. The early spring air carried the faintest whisper of change, a quiet suggestion of renewal. But for Nathaniel Brooks, everything felt frozen in place. Each morning began the same. The scent of his cologne, the crisp gleam of his cufflinks, the gentle whir of the espresso machine echoing through the penthouse. He would scroll through market reports on his tablet while Madison, always immaculately dressed, moved through the kitchen like she belonged there, offering reminders, updates, subtle guidance. On the surface, their lives resembled a perfectly lit magazine spread. Two ambitious figures. Aligned, composed, unstoppable. But beneath that polished frame, the smallest fractures were beginning to spread, and neither of them noticed how deep they already ran. In public, they were luminous. Their photos headlined industry publications. They co-hosted black-tie fundraisers. They moved through elite circles with rehearsed elegance. Madison had fully stepped into the role Serena once held, always beside Nathaniel, taking notes, shaking hands, managing the story of his reinvention. But unlike Serena, Madison wasn't satisfied standing next to power. She wanted to wield it, shape it, bend it toward her vision. Nathaniel had admired that once. It had felt thrilling, kinetic. But now that energy had started to burn, and he didn't yet know whether it would temper something stronger or scorch everything. Behind closed doors, Madison's confidence had sharpened. She pushed harder, for influence, for say. She challenged his decisions in tones just soft enough to sound helpful, but pointed enough to sting. She began holding client meetings solo, adjusting timelines, altering brand strategies, all framed under efficiency. Nathaniel tried to address it, gently at first. "You could have just run that by me," he'd say. Or, "Next time, let's talk before shifting the plan." "Let's review things together first," Madison would say with a soft smile, kissing Nathaniel's cheek. "I'm just trying to help, Nate. You've got too much on your plate." At first, he believed her. But over time, doubts began to creep in. Not loud, not jarring, but persistent. Always there, just beneath the surface. Meanwhile, across the city, Serena was quietly preparing a different kind of battlefield. The studio had transformed in just a few weeks. Where there had once been dusty concrete and scattered debris, there was now warm, layered lighting, thoughtfully selected artwork, clean, functional tables adorned with simple floral arrangements, an open floor plan, ready for workshops, dialogue, and reinvention. It didn't scream luxury. It spoke of intention, an elegant, grounded space, not created to impress, but to empower. Serena hadn't planned to move so quickly. But momentum has a way of claiming its own pace. Celia had introduced her to a few people, local founders, creatives, guest speakers, and word spread faster than expected. Before she knew it, Serena was leading strategy sessions for women re-entering the workforce, offering consulting services to small businesses, mentoring professionals just starting out. She became a name that meant something. Not because of her past with Nathaniel Brooks, but in spite of it. In these circles, Serena wasn't his former wife. She was a mentor, a strategist, a quiet force who understood what it meant to fight battles without making noise, and still win. But Serena wasn't building out of vengeance. She was building to remember who she was. Still, she wasn't naive. She knew Nathaniel was watching. He hadn't reached out, but the signals were clear. Mutual acquaintances asking pointed questions. Old business contacts of his suddenly appearing at her events, feigning ignorance of her story. She greeted them all with calm, never flinched, never let them see behind the curtain. She didn't want a war. But if one came, she was ready. One afternoon while reviewing her calendar at the studio, Serena received an unexpected call. Jonathan Marks, a respected investor, a key figure in one of Nathaniel's most high-profile acquisitions. They had met once, briefly, at a fundraiser years ago. She hardly remembered the exchange, but now, here he was, calling, asking if she'd be open to a meeting. "I've been hearing about what you're doing," he said. "Your vision, it's refreshing. It's smart. I'd like to hear more." Serena hesitated for a beat, then agreed to meet the next day. She arrived at a quiet, upscale restaurant, minimal decor, polished wood, soft lighting. To her surprise, Jonathan was already seated, scanning a document. He stood the moment he saw her, offering a firm, respectful handshake. "Serena," he greeted her warmly. "Thank you for coming on short notice," Jonathan said with a smile. "I've been hearing your name a lot lately." "That's unexpected," Serena replied with a calm smile. "But I'll take it as a compliment." Jonathan chuckled. "It should be. What you're doing, it's smart, grounded, and honestly, it's more in step with where the market is going than most of the inflated noise I hear in boardrooms." She tilted her head slightly. "I didn't know you were keeping an eye on grassroots initiatives." "I wasn't," he admitted. "Not until yours started making waves. Your events, they're not just small talk in the community. People are paying attention, and not just to the work, but to you." Serena stayed silent, unsure where this conversation was heading. "I always knew you weren't just the woman standing behind Nathaniel Brooks," he continued. "But now, the industry is starting to see it too. And that matters." "What exactly are you suggesting?" she asked. Jonathan leaned in just slightly. "I'm suggesting we explore a partnership. I've got portfolios I've been waiting to transition into education-focused, community-based initiatives. Your model fits better than anything I've reviewed in months." Serena leaned back in her chair, carefully weighing his words. This wasn't just praise, it was a doorway, one she hadn't imagined would ever open. "Let me think about it," she said after a long pause. "Of course," Jonathan replied, but the look in his eyes said he knew. She wouldn't say no, at least not forever. That evening, Serena returned home with her mind in overdrive. She sat at the kitchen table, opened her notebook, and began sketching out a roadmap. Her pen moved fast. The words poured out, unfiltered and clear. She wasn't just responding anymore. She was leading. She was building on her own terms. Back at the penthouse, Nathaniel was pacing. A tight current of tension had settled over the apartment all week. That morning, he'd received a financial report showing a slow, unexplained decline in revenue across several of his major accounts. Nothing devastating. Not yet. But it was enough. Clients had stopped returning calls promptly. Partners were dragging their feet on key decisions. Things were stalling, subtly but unmistakably. Nathaniel spent hours chasing explanations. Was it sabotage or incompetence? He didn't know what disturbed him more, the possibility of being betrayed, or the idea that the empire he thought unshakable was beginning to slip through his hands. Madison entered the room, phone still in hand, lips pressed tightly together. "You're not listening to me anymore," she said flatly. Nathaniel turned sharply. "What are you talking about?" "You're paranoid," she shot back. "You've second-guessed every move I've made this week. You don't trust me." "I'm seeing cracks in deals we should have closed months ago," he said. "Maybe the cracks were already there," she replied, her tone sharp and unapologetic now. "Maybe you just didn't see them because you were too busy blaming everyone else." He stepped toward her. "Are you saying this is my fault?" "I'm saying," she replied, locking eyes with him, "that maybe not everything falling apart is about me." He stared at her, caught off guard, unsure what to say. Madison turned and walked out before he could respond. That night, as Nathaniel stood by the window with a glass in hand, he caught his reflection. And for the first time, it looked different, not like a titan, not like a man in command, but like someone who had won a war and no longer knew how to govern peace. And somewhere across town, Serena was reviewing a new proposal from Jonathan Marks. A faint smile played at the corner of her lips as the breeze rustled through the open window beside her. She closed her notebook, leaned back in her chair, and recognized a feeling she hadn't touched in years. She wasn't rebuilding anymore. She was rising. The evening wrapped the city in a thick velvet warmth, indulgent and heavy with promise. The Brooks penthouse, as always, was staged to impress. Crystal vases overflowed with white orchids. Champagne flutes lined the marble counters. Soft, ambient lighting glowed from hidden fixtures above. Outside the floor-to-ceiling windows, the skyline glittered, a moving, breathing canvas for yet another meticulously curated affair. Tonight was a private pre-gala reception, a gathering of influencers from finance, media, and politics. The kind of night where alliances were sealed with a toast and power shifted hands through whispers cloaked in civility. Nathaniel stood at the center of it all, tailored in a midnight blue tuxedo, cufflinks gleaming under the lights. He moved through the room like a seasoned conductor, greeting investors, exchanging jokes with CEOs, posing for just enough photos to keep the narrative alive before the cameras were quietly shown out. Beside him, Madison executed her role flawlessly. Her floor-length silk gown clung to her silhouette, every element of her appearance curated to signal status, elegance, and power. Her laughter rang out at just the right moments. Her eyes sparkled with the kind of intimacy that drew people in, made them trust her, confess things they'd never say elsewhere. She knew how to stand just behind Nathaniel, close enough to signal significance, distant enough to suggest deference. She was flawless, but something hung beneath the surface of the evening. A subtle dissonance, invisible to most, yet perceptible to anyone watching closely. There was a tension in Nathaniel's jaw when no one was looking, a stiffness in Madison's smile when he corrected her in front of others. Their chemistry, once impulsive and magnetic, had calcified into a dynamic that looked less like a relationship and more like a negotiation. They exchanged glances across the room, not with longing, but with calculation. It wasn't about connection anymore. It was about alignment, positioning, leverage. While guests sipped imported wine and made whispered business deals, Serena stepped into a quiet bookstore on the other side of the city. One of those hidden places tucked between a dry cleaner and a flower shop. Wooden floors that creaked, air rich with the scent of aged paper and time. She had promised herself she'd stop by after dinner, with Micah. A rare moment when he seemed genuinely excited, eager to share something from his literature class. They moved slowly through the aisles together, Micah pointing out titles he needed, Serena brushing her fingers along the spines of books she hadn't thought about in years. There was something grounding about the space, something real. As she reached for a book on a high shelf, her phone buzzed in her bag. A message from Celia. "We've got a confirmed date for the launch. Next Friday. Everything's moving fast. You ready?" Serena stared at the message for a long moment, then typed, "Yes, let's do it." That single word, ready, carried weight now. Not long ago she would have paused, second-guessed, worried about logistics, about failing. But something inside had shifted. She wasn't asking for permission anymore. She was moving, building, claiming space, and for the first time in years, she wasn't afraid of how much she wanted it. Back at the penthouse, a guest leaned close to Madison and whispered something in her ear. For just a split second, she froze. Nathaniel caught the flicker in her expression, subtle but real. When the guest moved on, he stepped closer. "What was that about?" he asked, voice low. Madison's lips pressed tight. "Nothing important." "Madison," he said, his tone firmer, quieter. "Don't treat me like one of your investors. What did he say?" She hesitated, then finally replied, "He mentioned Serena, said she's hosting a launch event next week." Her voice was even, measured. "Apparently it's getting a lot of attention in certain circles." Nathaniel blinked. "What kind of event?" "I don't know. Some sort of business initiative, maybe a consultancy or mentorship program." She didn't give details, just said Serena's name is starting to circulate again. Nathaniel let out a breathy laugh. But it wasn't amusement, it was disbelief. "She's hosting networking parties now?" "She's building something, Nate. People are paying attention." His face darkened. "People pay attention to anything new for 5 minutes. That doesn't mean it's meaningful." "Maybe," Madison replied coolly, turning to refill her glass. But the conversation clung to him. Later that night, after the last guest had gone and the staff had begun clearing champagne flutes and extinguishing candles, Nathaniel sat alone on the terrace, a drink in hand, the city stretching out endlessly before him. The music had stopped, but his thoughts hadn't. He hadn't thought about Serena's ambitions in years. He had assumed she didn't have any. That was always the difference between them. He moved forward, she stabilized. He innovated, she maintained. Or so he thought. He picked up his phone and did something he hadn't done in a long time. He typed her name. Articles loaded instantly. Features in local magazines, interview clips, blog posts praising her workshops. A video from a small business conference appeared at the top of the results. He clicked. There she was, standing in front of a modest crowd. Confident, clear. Speaking about reinvention, resilience, navigating transition with grace and purpose. She didn't mention him, didn't allude to their past. She wasn't bitter. She wasn't selling promises or performance. She was telling the truth, and people were listening. Nathaniel watched the entire video in silence. When it ended, he leaned back in his chair, staring up at the black sky. He wasn't sure what unsettled him more, that she had found her voice, or that, after all those years, he had never truly heard it. The next morning, Madison noticed the shift. He was quiet, detached. When she brought up their upcoming gala appearance, he waved her off. "You handle it," he muttered, eyes still fixed on his tablet. She looked at him for a moment, searching for something, then turned and walked away without another word. Across town, Serena stood in the middle of her studio. Her team was moving in perfect rhythm, arranging chairs, testing equipment, adjusting banners. Vendors were setting up outside. Volunteers distributed welcome packets by the door. The room pulsed with energy, and for the first time in a long time, Serena didn't feel like an outsider peering into someone else's dream. She wasn't the plus one. She wasn't the support act. She wasn't background. She was centered, present. A creator, a leader, a woman with her own name, her own vision, her own narrative. She walked over to the far corner where Micah was helping a technician calibrate the projector. He turned to her with a rare smile. "This looks amazing, Mom." "Thanks," Serena said, placing a hand on Micah's shoulder. "It's just the beginning." Outside, guests began to arrive, some familiar, some entirely new, all of them curious. Serena stood near the entrance, welcoming each person with calm confidence. She noticed a young woman lingering just past the door, early 30s, notebook clutched tightly to her chest, hesitant to step inside. Serena walked over, her smile gentle. "First time?" she asked softly. The woman nodded. "I almost didn't come. I didn't think I'd fit in." "You already do," Serena replied. "Come on in." And just like that, Honora began. The sound of Madison's heels echoed sharply across the marble floor of the Brooks penthouse, each step deliberate. Her voice, crisp and direct, carried through the space as she gave instructions over the phone to a caterer about an upcoming dinner she was organizing for a potential client. Nathaniel, meanwhile, sat on the edge of the couch, eyes on the muted television. The news ticker crawled across the bottom of the screen, but he wasn't absorbing it. His mind was tangled elsewhere, processing conversations he hadn't yet had, and thoughts he hadn't quite formed into words. He'd been quieter lately, less engaged. He replied to emails without urgency, skimmed reports instead of analyzing them, delegated meetings he'd normally lead himself. Madison noticed. She hadn't said anything at first. She preferred to observe. But now, the shift unsettled her. This wasn't the usual distraction from work or pressure from expansion. It was something deeper, something she couldn't name. "You're not sleeping," she said plainly that night as she walked into the bedroom and found him lying awake, staring at the ceiling. The glow from his tablet illuminated the lines on his face. He glanced over. "I'm just thinking." "You've been just thinking for 2 weeks." He didn't respond right away. He set the tablet down and sat up, running a hand through his hair. "I've been reading about Serena." Madison stiffened. "Why?" "Because I want to understand what she's doing, how it's growing, how it's connecting with people." "I didn't think she could." He trailed off. Madison sat on the edge of the bed, her expression unreadable. "Maybe it's nothing. A few flattering articles, some well-timed praise." "It happens," Nathaniel said, his voice quieter than usual. "People love a comeback story." He paused. "But this doesn't feel temporary. It feels deliberate." Madison didn't respond. She walked over to her vanity and began taking off her earrings, one by one. "Are you regretting something, Nate?" He met her gaze in the mirror. "No, I'm observing." But Madison had known him long enough to recognize the shift in his tone. It was the same voice he used when he began reevaluating business deals, when he started reassessing risk. It was the sound of mental ledgers being recalculated behind still eyes, and it irritated her. She had worked too carefully, moved too precisely, to have him suddenly distracted by the distant echo of a life he had chosen to leave behind. The next day, Nathaniel attended a luncheon hosted by the Chamber of Commerce, an annual event he had never missed. The room was full of familiar faces, executives, philanthropists, journalists, socialites. But for the first time in years, Nathaniel didn't feel like the gravitational center. Conversations drifted around him, laughter erupted from tables where he wasn't seated. And the keynote speaker, someone he had once mentored, barely acknowledged him during their address. It wasn't overt, it wasn't rude, it was subtle. Shifts in posture, tones of polite indifference, signals that the tide was turning, alliances shifting beneath the surface. Then he heard it. Her name. Did you hear about Serena Brooks' new partnership? She's doing something incredible with community enterprise funding. It's more sustainable than anything Brooks has pushed in years. He wasn't meant to hear it, but he did, and it stuck. That evening, back at the penthouse, Madison found him in the study. The room was dimly lit. Open folders and scattered reports covered the desk, and a half-empty bottle of whiskey sat beside him. He didn't look up when she entered. He was focused on a document, one he had pulled from the archives. A strategic draft that Serena had written during the early years of the company's growth. He remembered mocking it at the time, calling it too idealistic, too long-term, too focused on community instead of capital. But now, as he read through her handwritten notes, something in them didn't feel naive anymore. They felt relevant, prescient. Again, he saw it differently. There was structure in her vision now, depth in her analysis. Ideas he had once dismissed as impractical were beginning to feel prophetic. She was ahead of me in some ways, Nathaniel said quietly when he noticed Madison standing at the doorway. She raised an eyebrow. Excuse me, Serena? She was thinking about things I never paid attention to. Madison crossed her arms, irritation rising beneath the surface. And what exactly are you trying to say? I'm not saying anything, he replied calmly, his eyes still on the document. I'm realizing things. Madison didn't respond. She turned and walked away, the door to the bedroom closing behind her harder than it needed to. Meanwhile, at her studio, Serena was finalizing a new series of mentorship programs. The launch had exceeded every expectation. Several guests had approached her afterward with partnership proposals. 2 local investors had expressed interest in funding her next phase. One young founder, battling investor intimidation, had written Serena a letter that moved her to tears. Not from sadness, but recognition. In the young woman's struggle, she saw herself. The version of Serena who once stood beside Nathaniel, full of strategy and strength, but constantly told to play support. Now she spent hours each night refining proposals, shaping curriculum, mapping scalable models. Micah often sat nearby on the couch, earbuds in, typing away on homework. They didn't speak much during those late evenings, but the silence between them was warm, companionable. It was a new rhythm, a quieter kind of family, but fuller, richer than she ever anticipated. One evening, while sorting through old boxes of notes and folders, Serena found a photograph. She and Nathaniel at one of their first corporate retreats. He had his arm around her shoulder. They were laughing, unfiltered, hopeful. She stared at it for a long time, not with longing, but detachment. That moment, that version of them, didn't exist anymore, and it didn't need to. She slid the photo back into the box, then paused. Her fingers pulled out a different envelope. A letter, written in the final weeks of their marriage. Never sent. It wasn't sentimental. It was a record, a structured document. Notes and questions around specific financial decisions made during their partnership, choices she had once challenged and he had dismissed. But now, as she reread the figures and her annotations, something shifted. There were assets, real estate holdings, dormant accounts. Licensing rights had been moved, without formal documentation. Some of those decisions, if traced properly, could open a door Serena had never thought to approach before. She inhaled deeply, then closed the envelope and set it aside. Not as a threat, not as leverage, but as a possibility. A lever, if ever needed. Back at the penthouse, Madison felt increasingly unsettled. She watched Nathaniel drift further into himself. Speaking less, questioning more. He'd begun reviewing old projects, revisiting initiatives she thought had been shelved years ago. He was unraveling, not in loud, self-destructive ways, but in quiet recalculations. Minute shifts in energy, subtle refusals to share. He had even started locking his office door when she wasn't home. One afternoon, while Nathaniel was out, Madison slipped into his office. She moved methodically, browsing reports, memos, correspondence. At first it was nothing unusual, but then she found a folder. Brooks Provisional Holdings. Inside, documents she had never seen before. Shell companies, offshore accounts, equity shares held through layered proxies. It wasn't illegal, but it wasn't clean. And suddenly she began to wonder, how much had Serena known? How much had she signed unwittingly? How much had she documented? The board was shifting. But Madison couldn't yet tell who was controlling the game. And neither could Nathaniel. It was early morning when the first shipment of gold-trimmed invitations arrived at the penthouse. Madison stood in the foyer, arms crossed, watching staff carry in box after box of hand-tied envelopes. Silk ribbons, Parisian embossing. The scent of fresh glue and elegance clung to the air. She opened one of the boxes, slid out an invitation, and ran her fingers over the lettering. Everything had been handcrafted, just as she requested. Nathaniel had approved the design weeks ago, more out of obligation than excitement. Now the official countdown had begun. Their wedding was 32 days away. The announcement had already graced the social pages. Media outlets hailed it as the most anticipated union of the year, a convergence of power and beauty, wealth and ambition. Madison's face had adorned bridal spreads. She was called the modern muse of luxury. Nathaniel had agreed to a single, high-profile interview. In it, he described his future wife as brilliant, elegant, and everything I never knew I needed. The line had been written by his publicist, but Madison had smiled anyway. It played well. Behind the scenes, however, the wedding planning was anything but dreamy. It had become a process, a machine. Madison's mood had grown razor-sharp. She snapped at assistants over minor errors, dismissed vendors who didn't meet her standards. Madison revised the seating chart a dozen times before breakfast. Her stress seeped into every space she entered. She began micromanaging the florists, insisting the arrangements feel more timeless, whatever that meant. She sent the cake designer back to the sketchpad 3 separate times. The design felt too traditional. It wasn't about Nathaniel. It wasn't even about herself. It was about the image, the message. This wedding was her coronation, and she wouldn't let anyone forget it. Meanwhile, Nathaniel was more withdrawn than ever. He let Madison handle the details. He nodded through meetings, approved invoices without reading them, showed up when needed, but mentally, he was far away. His thoughts drifted to Serena, what she was building, how her name kept appearing in conversations he used to dominate without resistance. At first, he brushed it off as noise. Then it became an echo. Now it was something more. A presence, even though she hadn't stepped into his world for months, or so he believed. What he didn't know was this. Serena had already received an invitation. The moment the engagement announcement hit the press, a ripple moved through the social networks she now moved through, graceful, private, unbothered. Her new partners, clients, collaborators, they noticed. Some mentioned it softly, others with obvious curiosity. Serena said nothing. She smiled, then moved on with her day. The studio thrived. The mentorship program expanded. A podcast producer reached out. A literary agent asked about a book. She wasn't driven by revenge. She was driven by purpose, reclaimed, redefined. And yet, somewhere deep in the corners of her mind, something twisted at the thought of Madison in a white gown, standing beside Nathaniel. Not because she wanted him back. She didn't, but because it reminded her of herself, of how she had once been framed, polished, presented as an accessory to someone else's power. And she wondered, did Madison know what it truly meant to be that woman? It was Celia who suggested it. Send him something, she said over coffee one afternoon. Not out of bitterness, out of strategy. You're playing chess now, Serena. Stop pretending you're not. Serena had laughed. Send him what? Celia leaned in, eyes gleaming. Send him a memory. Serena thought about it for days. She didn't want drama. She didn't want to provoke. But a memory? That was different. That was layered. Not a threat. A signal. Something only Nathaniel would recognize. Something personal, private. A message. This is who I was. This is what I know. The following week, While Madison buried herself in menu tastings and calligraphy decisions, Serena sat quietly at her kitchen table, drafting a letter. The words came slowly at first, then with clarity. Clean, deliberate lines. She didn't mention love, didn't reference the past. She wrote about business, about integrity, about records. She alluded to things only Nathaniel would remember. Specific transactions, particular dates, moments he likely assumed she had forgotten or never noticed at all. She didn't accuse, she implied. She didn't demand, she observed. And at the very end, she included a sentence that would seem harmless to anyone else, but would hit Nathaniel like a silent detonation. I've been reviewing old files, just out of curiosity. It's remarkable how much we overlook when we trust too easily. She printed the letter, folded it precisely, slipped it into an elegant envelope. No return address, no signature. Just his name, handwritten with intention, Nathaniel Brooks. The envelope was delivered by private courier to the rehearsal dinner venue, late Friday afternoon. Just as the event coordinator was finalizing lighting angles in the grand ballroom, the courier gave clear instructions. Direct to the groom's suite, no exceptions. The staff complied. The envelope was left on a side table in Nathaniel's suite, amidst seating charts, fabric swatches, champagne bottles, and neatly stacked vendor folders. For hours it went unnoticed. When he finally picked it up, he assumed it was from a vendor. Something minor, forgettable. He opened it casually. At first, the contents confused him. Then, the familiarity set in, and with it, a creeping discomfort. He read it once, then again, and again. By the fourth reading, his hands were trembling slightly. He didn't speak. Madison was in the next room, locked in an argument with a stylist over tie colors. Nathaniel sat motionless, eyes on the letter, trying to decode its purpose, its precision. He didn't know why it shook him. There was nothing overtly threatening, but the restraint carried weight, an unspoken warning. Serena hadn't written like a woman seeking attention. She had written like a strategist, calm, composed, reclaiming her position at the table. When Madison finally entered the room, she immediately sensed the change in his energy. What's wrong? Madison asked the question casually, reaching for her glass of wine. Nathaniel folded the letter quickly and slipped it into his jacket pocket. Nothing, he said, just a reminder of something I need to review. But his voice gave him away. That night, as they stood on the rehearsal stage, posing for photos, thanking guests, Nathaniel's mind was somewhere else entirely. He didn't hear the toasts, didn't register the music. His thoughts spiraled back to Serena's letter, to her words, to the precision of her timing. Days before the wedding, in the middle of what was meant to be his most triumphant moment. He glanced across the room at Madison, radiant in her tailored dress, laughing easily with a cluster of designers, and for the first time, he wondered how much she really knew. About him, about the business, about everything that came before her. That night, he didn't sleep. Long after Madison had drifted off, Nathaniel rose from bed and stood by the window, staring out at the city skyline. It hadn't changed, but something in him had. He couldn't name it yet. But it was there, quiet, constant, like tectonic plates shifting beneath the surface. Somewhere across town, Serena sat in her studio, alone, a mug of tea cupped in her hands, reviewing the final draft of her upcoming keynote address. The air was still. The light was warm and soft. She didn't know how he'd react to the letter, but she didn't need to. She had done what she intended, and that was enough. The wedding day approached like a ticking clock, its rhythm etched into every list, every whispered directive between stylists and planners. The venue had been transformed into a spectacle. Cascading white roses, satin runners lining polished floors, every detail glimmering with intent. It was the kind of event society would remember, a performance of love cloaked in grandeur. Wealth masquerading as intimacy. Cameras clicked, columns were already half-written. But beneath the pageantry, something stirred. Nathaniel felt it like a hum in his chest, low, persistent, unheard by anyone else. He moved through the day with practiced ease, nodding at guests, approving last-minute changes, shaking hands with vendors. Madison, ever composed, remained the image of elegance. She smiled for interviews, directed photographers, held her posture like royalty, but behind her eyes, there was steel. Madison wasn't just preparing to become a wife. She was preparing to secure her position, to claim the final piece of a kingdom she had meticulously worked her way into. This ceremony wasn't a beginning for her. It was a culmination. The moment where everything she'd maneuvered for finally became hers. But Nathaniel's thoughts had drifted far from the floral arches and linen swatches. Serena's letter had burrowed deep into his consciousness, and the more he tried to dismiss it, the louder its implications echoed in his mind. He had reread it more times than he would admit. Each pass peeled back a new layer: subtext, neutral phrasing masking precision, lines referencing financial structures he thought only he knew, decisions made in hushed meetings, documents signed under pressure, assets funneled through shell companies to shield them from scrutiny. Back then, he had believed Serena simply signed whatever he gave her. Now, he wasn't so sure, and that uncertainty gnawed at him. In the days leading up to the wedding, while Madison was consumed with dress fittings and run-throughs, Nathaniel locked himself in his home office. He pulled old records, revisited tax filings, dusted off legal agreements left untouched for nearly a decade. The deeper he went, the more questions surfaced. Some assets were no longer in his name. Others had shifted ownership mysteriously years ago through quiet, forgettable transactions. What once seemed routine now mapped out a pattern he couldn't explain. And then there were the dormant accounts tied to ventures that never launched, companies that existed only on paper. Serena had signed many of them, but he remembered now, she also always asked for duplicates, calmly. No scene, color-coded folders meticulously labeled. He used to think it was just her way of feeling included. But what if it wasn't? What if, even then, she had been preparing? The realization settled over him like concrete. Heavy, inevitable. Late one night, he poured himself a drink and stood by the window, watching the city shimmer under its own secrets. He had always believed he was untouchable, that Serena was too soft, too agreeable, too silent to ever be a threat. But maybe that had been the greatest error of all, confusing quiet for weakness. Across town, Serena sat at her desk, flipping through a binder of old financial records. Each page was a quiet witness to years spent beside Nathaniel, to conversations she wasn't supposed to remember, to signatures she was never meant to understand. She hadn't opened these files in years, but now, with everything shifting beneath the surface, she needed clarity. She wasn't planning to expose him, not publicly. That wasn't her intention. But if it came to that, if he tried to cut her out, to erase her share, to weaponize the past, she would be ready. She would be ready, not just with conviction, but with facts. Cold, clean facts. Her fingers brushed against a photo tucked between pages, a much younger version of herself, standing beside Nathaniel during a groundbreaking ceremony. She looked different then, softer, more hopeful. She held the photo for a beat, then gently set it aside. That woman was gone. In her place stood someone stronger, forged not through ambition, but through years of compromise, of silence, and now, clarity. Celia arrived soon after, a folder tucked under her arm. "I went through the rest of the records," she said, setting it on the table. "You were right. Some of the transfers look questionable." "Can we prove it?" Serena asked. "Not in court, not yet, not without more. But we can raise enough doubt to make him sweat. And in his world, doubt is poison." Serena nodded slowly. "I don't want to destroy him," she said. "I just want him to know I'm not invisible anymore." Celia smiled. "Oh, he knows." She leaned in. "The question is, what will he do about it?" Meanwhile, Madison had begun to sense the change in Nathaniel. He was disengaged, detached, uninterested in final fittings, apathetic about honeymoon planning, indifferent to press logistics. He answered her questions with vacant nods, looked past her when she spoke, as for hours, peered into his office explanation. When she confronted him, he waved it off. "I'm managing pre-wedding logistics." "Since when do you care about floral invoices and floor plans?" she asked sharply. He turned, met her gaze, eyes tired, words flat. "There are things you don't understand." "Then make me understand," she snapped. But he didn't. He just grew quieter, more distant. And Madison, for all her precision, poise, and control, began to feel something unfamiliar creeping in. Unease. The rehearsal dinner was magnificent. A showcase. Laughter rippling across candlelit tables, crystal glasses clinking, expensive wine flowing, praise and speeches from peers. Nathaniel stood at the head of the table, glass raised, voice polished. His toast was articulate, but hollow. Madison stood beside him, glowing, her smile flawless. her eyes scanning the room for cracks in the veneer. Then, just as dessert was being served, a server approached Nathaniel quietly. He carried a small box, wrapped in refined paper, tied with a single silk ribbon. Nathaniel looked at it. Curiously, there was no card, no sender listed, just a delicate ribbon and an envelope, tucked inside, his name written in a handwriting he recognized instantly. Nathaniel opened it slowly. Inside, a single object, a gold bracelet. Simple, classic, the same bracelet he had once given Serena on their 10th anniversary, the same one she had worn every day for years without fail. He knew it immediately. But it wasn't the bracelet itself that stopped him cold. It was the note beneath it. Some things you try to replace, others return to remind you they were never truly gone. He stared at it for a long time, his fingers curled tightly around the cool metal. Madison noticed the shift in his expression. "What is it?" she asked. But Nathaniel didn't answer. Because in that moment, something unspoken clicked into place. The past wasn't just echoing anymore. It was speaking. The sun had barely crested the horizon when Nathaniel Brooks stepped into the private suite reserved for him on the top floor of the wedding venue. The floor-to-ceiling windows framed the city like a painting. Still, immaculate, sterile in its precision. Everything was as Madison had arranged, silver cufflinks laid out neatly, his custom tuxedo hanging, pressed to perfection. The cologne bottle shifted just slightly, as if to signal the ritual of control. But nothing about the morning felt controlled to him. His chest was heavy with unease. Sleep had never come. He had tossed restlessly beneath silk sheets, haunted not by dreams but by silence. The kind of silence that presses into you, louder than any scream, more persistent than any memory. He walked toward the desk, half-heartedly intending to review his notes for the ceremony. Madison had insisted they write their own vows, but he stopped when he noticed it. An envelope, placed precisely at the edge of the surface. It wasn't there last night. This one was different. No shimmering gold trim, no ornate initials, just plain ivory paper sealed with a simple wax stamp. No name on the outside, but Nathaniel didn't need a name. He knew. His fingers trembled slightly as he broke the seal. He unfolded the letter carefully. The paper was thick, heavy, textured, deliberate. The handwriting was unmistakably Serena's, elegant, controlled, deeply familiar. He braced himself and began to read. It didn't start with bitterness. There were no accusations, no venom, no pleading. It began with reflection. Calm, measured. She wrote about time, how it stretches and folds unexpectedly. She wrote about how trust can become invisible until it isn't. She wrote about how silence sometimes speaks more clearly than words. And then, without prelude, without drama, she laid it out. Details, dates, specific dates, transactions, agreements. Company names, names Nathaniel hadn't heard in years. She referenced bank transfers, shell corporations, asset reallocations. Some he remembered, some he had forgotten entirely. But what stunned him wasn't just the information, it was the structure, the precision. Serena had taken years of silent observation and shaped them into something sharp, something surgical. She connected dots he hadn't even realized were visible. Flagged inconsistencies no accountant ever caught. Highlighted discrepancies buried beneath layers of legal camouflage. She never accused him of anything illegal. She didn't have to. The picture she painted was too clean, too deliberate, to ignore. It was in its restraint a threat, a quiet, devastating one. And then, near the end, her tone shifted. I never wanted war, Nathaniel, but I will not be erased. You taught me that empires are built on leverage. I have mine now. I don't intend to use it unless I'm forced to. Consider this letter a courtesy, a reminder. Some women don't burn bridges. They build ones you never saw coming. His palms were sweating, his throat dry. He read the letter again, slower this time, looking for a hole, a misspelling, a misstep. There were none. Serena had always been meticulous, but now he finally understood the depth of that. He folded the letter carefully, slipped it back into the envelope, and sat heavily in the leather chair by the window. Outside, the city was waking up. But inside him, something was fracturing. His thoughts unraveled. Could she access those files? Were the companies still partially tied to her name? Could she prove the transfers? He remembered now how she had asked gently, insistently, that her name remain on a few documents. For safety, he had agreed, half listening, focused on bigger things. Back then, it felt harmless, naive. Now it felt catastrophic. There was a knock at the door. Madison's voice came through, soft but tense. "Nate, you okay?" He didn't respond right away. Ran a hand through his hair, swallowed hard, then forced calm into his voice. "I'm fine. Just give me a minute. Everyone's waiting downstairs. The photographer wants pre-ceremony shots. I'll be there soon." Silence. Then Madison's footsteps faded down the hallway. Nathaniel stood, walked slowly to the mirror, stared at his reflection. Impeccably dressed, groomed, composed. But the man looking back at him felt foreign. No longer the titan in control, but a man standing at the edge of something unknown, unsure if the ground beneath him would hold. He reached into his jacket pocket and placed the letter back inside, folding it neatly. He didn't know why he brought it, only that he couldn't leave it behind. The ceremony passed in a blur. Guests stood as Madison walked down the aisle, resplendent in her designer gown. Every motion was rehearsed, every detail flawless. The music swelled. Camera shutters clicked. Nathaniel smiled on cue. But inside, his thoughts spiraled. The letter, Serena's words, the terrifying precision of what she had laid before him. He stumbled slightly over his vows. No one noticed, except Madison. She threw him a glance. Subtle, sharp. "Don't ruin this." He recovered with a laugh, delivered his lines, but the weight of the letter pressed against his chest like stone. After the ceremony, while guests toasted and mingled, Nathaniel excused himself, claiming a call. He slipped into a private lounge, locked the door, and pulled out the letter once more. He read it again, slower this time, letting every word settle like sediment in his mind. There was no denying it. Serena held power, not speculative, not imagined. Real. And he had handed it to her, unknowingly, over years of arrogance and assumption. He had thought replacing her was progress, an upgrade, but he had never really seen her. Not her intelligence, not her quiet strategy, not her ability to hold complexity without ever raising her voice. Now she held his empire. Not in courts, not in tabloids, but in quiet, surgical leverage. And if she ever chose to act, she could dismantle him. Nathaniel sat there for a long time, the letter in his lap, the sounds of laughter and celebration muffled behind the walls. He knew he couldn't return. Not to the party, not to the illusion. Something had shifted. A truth had landed, not just about Serena, but about himself. And he didn't know which realization frightened him more. The morning after the wedding arrived wrapped in silence, not the kind that signals intimacy or peace, but the kind that thickens the air with unspoken tension. Every sound, a footstep, the creak of a chair, the soft clink of porcelain, felt too loud. Nathaniel sat alone at the breakfast table in the honeymoon suite, staring at a plate of untouched food. Madison had left. Madison had left earlier, off to an impromptu press interview about the wedding. Radiant. Strategic smiles, perfect angles. Nathaniel hadn't gone with her. He hadn't said much since the night before. The letter from Serena still rested in his jacket pocket, heavy, even after a dozen readings. It wasn't just the words. It was the consequence. The dawning realization that what he believed untouchable had already begun to shift beneath him. He had tried to suppress it during the reception, forced smiles, rehearsed toasts, staged affection. He kissed Madison's hand, played the role. But now there was only the silence of the honeymoon suite and 1,000 unanswered questions. His phone buzzed on the table. A notification. He glanced down, disinterested, then froze. Flagged alert from private banking advisory. Unusual activity detected. He opened the message, and his breath caught. Several accounts were now under temporary audit, flagged for inconsistencies in ownership. The audit wasn't triggered by the bank, but by an internal protocol, a buried safeguard, programmed to react to suspicious transfers linked to dormant corporate entities under his name, entities Serena had signed off on years ago. His heart raced. It has to be a mistake. He reached for his laptop, logged in. The secure dashboard lit up with red banners. Access restricted, pending investigation. Then the calls began. First his legal advisor, then his investment manager. Discrepancies in licensing rights, in ownership trails. Documents dated over a decade ago were resurfacing, and in every one small clauses, obscure stipulations, signatures, his and Serena's. His head spun. The empire he had spent years building, structured, shielded, calculated, was unraveling, not publicly, not yet, but no longer silently, and it would grow louder. Madison returned just as he was closing his laptop. Her voice sparkled with energy. The press had loved it, the photos had gone viral. Everyone was calling them the power couple of the year. She didn't notice his expression until she poured her coffee and turned toward him. "What's wrong?" she asked. He didn't answer, not at first. He just looked at her, slowly, as if seeing her, really seeing her, for the very first time. She asked again, sharper. "Nathaniel, what happened?" He slid the laptop toward her, opened the flagged dashboard. She stared at the screen, then at him. "What is this?" "An audit," he said flatly, "triggered by a series of old account transfers. The kind I never thought would be questioned, the kind I never thought she would remember." "Serena?" Madison whispered. He nodded. "I thought you said it was nothing, that she was just posturing." "I was wrong." For a long moment Madison said nothing. Then she stood, pacing the suite, her mind clearly racing. "Okay," she said finally. "We'll call the legal team. We'll freeze exposure. We can contain this." "It's not just about freezing anything," Nathaniel replied. His voice was quieter now, more shaken. "She's not coming after me publicly. She's undermining me privately. She's exposing every weak point I never reinforced." Madison turned sharply, frustration rising in her voice. "How did this even happen? You've had full control over everything for years." Nathaniel looked at her, and finally, he let the truth land. "I never actually had full control," he said. "I just thought I did." The words hung in the room, not like a revelation, but like a confession. Madison didn't respond right away. She poured herself another cup of coffee. Her hands trembled slightly. For the first time since their relationship began, she wasn't sure where she stood. Everything she'd built with Nathaniel had been constructed on the assumption of his invincibility. If that foundation cracked, what was she left standing on? That afternoon, Nathaniel worked the phones. He called in favors, reached out to silent partners, dug up old agreements, tried to pull strings he hadn't touched in years. But every call ended the same way: hesitation, distance, thinly veiled concern. People who once jumped to answer his calls now responded with careful language, soft reassurances, or worse, silence. He wasn't the untouchable figure anymore, and in the world he lived in, power respected power, not fragility. By evening, another blow hit. An anonymous tip had been submitted to the Financial Integrity Bureau, questioning conflict of interest clauses in one of his overseas ventures. The tip didn't come from Serena. She hadn't moved directly, but the timing? No coincidence. She had stirred the water, and now others were circling. The sharks were coming. Later that night, Madison snapped. She had just ended a tense call with their PR agent, Forward, when she stormed into the study and slammed her phone on the desk. "This is spiraling, Nate. People are already asking questions. Investors are nervous. We need to issue a statement." "No," Nathaniel said firmly. "You want to just sit and let this explode?" I said no. Madison's eyes narrowed. "You're going to let her dismantle everything, and you're not going to fight back?" He rose slowly from his chair. "She's not dismantling anything. She's just showing me where the cracks already were." "You're being sentimental," Madison snapped. "That's exactly how she's winning." "No," he said again. "She's winning, because I thought she never could." The words hit her like a slap. She stared at him, stunned. In that moment, she saw it clearly. The foundation of their relationship was shifting, not eroding, breaking. And for the first time, she understood something she had always chosen to ignore. Nathaniel's loyalty, whatever version of it he had ever offered, was never truly hers. It was situational, conditional. And now, as his world trembled, he wasn't reaching for her. He was looking backward, staring into a past he had tossed aside, now realizing that what he thought was dead had only been dormant. That night, while Madison packed a suitcase in silence, Nathaniel sat once again by the window. Serena's letter in hand, he read it again, slower. Then set it down. He picked up his phone, scrolled through his contacts until he found her name. Serena Brooks. His finger hovered over the call button, but he didn't press it, because he knew whatever apology he might offer, whatever words he might say, wouldn't change what had already begun. The collapse was already in motion. The suite was still in disarray when the sun rose. Soft, accusatory light spilled across the polished floors. Madison's half-packed suitcase sat by the door, flaps open, clothes spilling out like unfinished thoughts. Nathaniel sat motionless in the armchair by the fireplace, eyes sunken, jaw clenched, fingers rubbing slow, mechanical circles at his temple. The silence wasn't new. It had lived with them for days now, pressing in from every direction. But this morning, it carried weight. A finality no words could dress up. He hadn't spoken to Madison since the night before. And she hadn't tried. Something had ruptured. Not with screaming, not with thrown objects or slammed doors, but with stillness, with absence, with everything left unsaid, that now rang louder than any argument ever could. He thought of Serena constantly now, not with longing, but with regret and awe, as if after all this time he was only now seeing the full shape of the woman he had once underestimated. He kept returning to that one thought, the one that refused to let go. His greatest miscalculation hadn't been trusting her too little, it was believing she was too fragile to be feared, to matter. Serena hadn't fought him with fury, she had fought him with foresight. She hadn't stormed the gates of his empire, she had simply waited, patiently, silently, until the moment was right, to show him that she still held the keys to more than he remembered. And now? Every corner of his life, financial, professional, personal, was unraveling in ways he could no longer contain. By midday, another alert arrived. One of his key overseas investments had been suspended. Legal challenge, regulatory interference. He called his legal team. Their voices were tight, cautious, layered in disclaimers and carefully chosen phrasing. The quiet loyalty that had once shielded him was dissolving. Advisors were pulling back, quietly moving assets, reshuffling portfolios, preparing for the worst. One associate, a man who had once toasted his brilliance, sent a vague email, something about postponing future projects. Nathaniel read the message twice, then deleted it. No reply. His reputation wasn't ruined, not yet, but it was wounded. And in his world, a wound was more dangerous than a scandal. Scandals could be spun. Wounds bled slowly, silently, until one day, the entire body collapsed from within. Later that afternoon, Nathaniel tried to call Micah. He hadn't spoken to his son since the wedding. He dialed twice, hung up both times before it even rang. He didn't know what to say. Didn't know what kind of father he even was anymore. He wondered if Serena had told Micah anything, if she had explained, if Micah even cared. The distance between them felt unbridgeable, a chasm too wide for apologies. Madison returned that evening, but the air between them had changed, sharp, brittle. She moved through the suite with quiet efficiency. No questions, no confrontation. She answered him in clipped phrases, didn't ask about the latest fallout, didn't bring up the letter. She didn't press him about next steps, because something had shifted in her too. Not ambition, but belief. She had believed in his invincibility. Now that illusion was gone, and without it, she wasn't sure what they were standing on anymore. She poured herself a drink, sat across from him. Finally, she broke the silence. "What do you want me to do?" Nathaniel looked up slowly. "What do you mean?" "Do you want me to stay?" she asked. Her voice was calm, but direct. "Because if you do, I need to know that I'm not just standing beside a man who's already halfway out the door." He didn't answer. He looked at Madison, really looked at her. But the words didn't come. And in that still moment, he understood something he hadn't been ready to admit. He wasn't sure if he wanted her to stay. Not because she didn't matter, but because what had once made their connection feel powerful now felt hollow. Yes, they had built something. But what exactly? An image, a convenience, a mutual benefit disguised as intimacy. She didn't wait for his response. She simply stood, set her glass down, and walked to the bedroom. The door closed behind her with a quiet click. Not a slam, not drama, just final. The next morning, Nathaniel arrived at his office to find a sealed envelope on his desk. No courier, no tracking, just his name, written in handwriting he knew too well. His assistant had only said, "A woman dropped it off. Sunglasses, scarf, said it was personal." He opened it slowly. Inside, another letter, shorter this time. "I don't want what's yours, Nathaniel. I only want what's mine, what was always mine. You once taught me that control is perception. But what you forgot is that perception can shift, and now, so has the power. This isn't revenge. This is equilibrium." No signature. But he didn't need one. He sat for a long time after that, staring out the window, watching the traffic crawl past. And it struck him how fragile everything truly was. Not just his business, his legacy, his name. All his life he had measured success in numbers, in square footage, in accolades. But none of that shielded him now. Not from truth, not from consequence, not from the steady hands of someone he had once dismissed for being too quiet. Without fully knowing why, he stood, walked to the bookshelf in the corner of the office, and pulled out a frame hidden behind the books, an old photograph. Faded slightly at the edges. It was him and Serena, long before the penthouse, before the tabloids, one of their earliest business conferences. They weren't husband and wife yet. They were something stronger then. Partners. He stared at the photo for a long moment, then placed it face down on the shelf. That afternoon, he canceled 2 meetings, then a third, and sat alone as the sky turned gold and the city lit up one window at a time. Finally, just before sunset, he picked up his phone, scrolled to her name, Serena Brooks. He dialed once, twice, voicemail. He didn't leave a message. He hung up and sat in silence. Again, because even that he hadn't earned. She had realized now she held the power to deny. The air was crisp, carrying the soft, clean scent of rain from the night before. The kind that made the city feel fresher than it really was. Morning light streamed through the studio's wide windows, filtering into soft beams that danced across Serena's desk. A dozen open files, her pen resting between scribbled notes, a cup of warm coffee beside a vase of fresh tulips. This space, once hollow and filled only with dreams and cautious hope, now pulsed with quiet movement. Staff moved in and out of glass-walled meeting rooms, clients waited in the lounge, and from down the hall, laughter drifted from an active workshop. Serena stood at the wide glass wall of her office, watching it all like the quiet conductor of a steady, grounded symphony. She wasn't just the woman who had started this. She was the anchor of it, and she didn't need anyone to confirm that anymore. It had been months since the wedding, months since the letter, months since the carefully curated world of Nathaniel Brooks had begun to crack under its own weight. The news of his financial troubles had trickled out slowly, first as whispers in trade blogs, then as speculative features in financial columns. His empire hadn't collapsed, not completely, but it no longer held that gleaming, untouchable presence. Lawsuits were pending, questions had been raised, deals were being reevaluated, a board member had resigned, others were distancing themselves, shareholders were anxious. And Madison? She had vanished from public view not long after the wedding. No official statement, but the whispers moved faster than facts. Some said she'd taken a settlement and gone to Europe. Others said she had simply walked away, disillusioned and done. Either way, she was no longer beside Nathaniel. Serena hadn't followed every detail. She didn't need to. She knew enough. What mattered wasn't that he was suffering. What mattered was that he was facing it. The truth. That the life he built was never truly unshakable. That real power isn't in headlines, or square footage, or public perception. Real power lives in integrity, in patience, in quiet perseverance. She didn't celebrate his fall. There was no joy in watching someone unravel, not even someone who had once erased her like a sentence he no longer needed. But there was peace, not revenge, not triumph, just peace. She turned from the glass wall and walked back to her desk. Waiting there was a folder, the final proposal for a new national initiative, a partnership, a mentorship program for women in transitional phases, divorcees, widows, mothers re-entering the workforce after years away. The program would be partially funded by a grant Serena had secured after months of negotiations. The grant hadn't been awarded because of her name. It was awarded because of her impact. The proposal included plans for satellite locations in 3 cities, a digital platform, and a publishing deal, a collection of stories from the women Serena had helped. She reviewed the final document, signed it, and handed it to her assistant with a quiet, satisfied nod. Later that day, Micah stopped by after his afternoon class. He was taller now, more confident in the way he moved, his voice deeper, steady. He had started working part-time at the studio, helping with tech, digital systems, and social media strategies. There was a quiet maturity in him now that made Serena proud in ways she didn't always have words for. He dropped a takeaway coffee on her desk and sank into the armchair across from her. "You look tired," he said with a crooked grin. She laughed softly. "That's because I am." He studied her for a beat. "But you also look content." She nodded. "I am that too." A pause. Then he asked, "Did you ever think this would happen?" Serena smiled. "Not like this," she said honestly, "but I always hoped for something close. He looked around the office, took in the calm, the movement, the growth. "You built something real, Mom." "I tried to," she said, eyes soft, "and I did it differently this time. I didn't build it around someone else. I built it around what I believe in." He nodded, then stood, stretching. "I've got to finish that workshop deck. You want me to close up later?" "Please," she said, smiling. "And maybe check the projector cables." "Always," he replied, already heading for the door. As he left, Serena leaned back in her chair. Her eyes drifted toward a photo on the shelf, one from the first event ever held in the studio. The space had been raw. Hope had been cautious. Now, it wasn't hope, it was conviction. That evening, as she stepped out onto the sidewalk, the city buzzed softly around her. A musician strummed a guitar outside the cafe across the street. Laughter floated over wine glasses at sidewalk tables. The scent of roasted garlic drifted from the little Italian bistro on the corner. It wasn't the life she had once imagined, back when she was Serena Brooks, wife of Nathaniel, but it was hers. A life built not from glitter, but from grit. Not from perfection, but from purpose. She wouldn't trade it for any mansion, any diamond, any boardroom filled with hollow applause. She turned the corner, steps unhurried, posture relaxed. As she passed the newsstand, she caught sight of a business magazine, Nathaniel Brooks on the cover. The headline, "The Reckoning of a Titan." She paused, read it, then turned away without a second glance. At home, she stepped into her modest, elegant apartment, the warmth greeting her like an old friend. She slipped off her shoes, poured a glass of wine, and stepped onto the small balcony. The skyline stretched before her, the same one that once belonged to him. But it looked different now. Not because it had changed, but because she had. She took a deep breath, raised her glass toward the horizon, and toasted. To beginnings that rise from endings, to strength rediscovered, to the quiet, unstoppable power of silence, of grace, of resilience. Dear friend, sometimes life doesn't shatter all at once. It simply redirects us, quietly, slowly, until one day we look up and realize we've become someone stronger. Serena's story isn't just about loss, it's about reclamation, of voice, of worth, of self. The Stoics taught us that we mustn't chase control over what is external, but rather tend to the internal citadel, our integrity, our choices, our responses. Serena did just that. She didn't fight to win, she rose to become. And in doing so, she reminded us that power isn't loud. Sometimes it walks barefoot across a balcony, holding a glass of wine, smiling at who we've become. Here's to your next beginning. May it come not when you're ready, but when you're real. If this story moved you even a little, help it reach someone else who needs it. Like, share, and subscribe. We're just getting started.